Hello, dear listener. Lady Whistledown's here, and I must confess that this season has delivered scandals so delicious, so utterly confounding to the natural order of things, that even I find myself breathless with anticipation to share them with you. Three sisters conquered society, but only one captured England's most coveted duke. England's most desired duke just bowed to the forgotten sister. But when Delora's desperate debts were exposed at the worst possible moment, love turned to scandal in a single heartbeat. Truth shattered lies, redemption conquered pride, and the forgotten sister became the season's most celebrated bride. But tell me, dear, can a heart truly heal when trust has been shattered by those we love most? Subscribe now if scandal makes your heart race. Tell me below, where are you listening from tonight? Now then, let us begin this tale of love and betrayal. The grandest ballroom in all of London. Almack's assembly rooms gleaming with 1,000 candles, the cream of society swirling in silks and diamonds. Three magnificent brides hold court at the very centre of this glittering spectacle, each more radiant than the last. The youngest, Shania, barely 18, and already wed to an earl whose devotion borders on the theatrical. The middle sister, Clarine, 22, and possessed of the kind of golden beauty that makes poets weep, now a countess, with lands stretching across 3 counties. But it is not these celebrated beauties who have captured my quill tonight, dear listener. No, it is their elder sister who stands forgotten in the shadows. Delora, at 27, the architect of their triumph and the sacrifice upon which their glory was built. While London celebrated the unprecedented success of 3 sisters marrying into nobility within a single season, I watched Delora retreat further into the alcoves, her modest gown a whisper against the symphony of silk surrounding her. She, who had orchestrated every introduction, managed every debt, secured every advantage that led to her sisters' coronations, remained invisible to the very society that now worshipped at their feet. But then, dear listener, something extraordinary occurred. The ballroom fell silent. Not the polite hush of anticipated entertainment, but the breathless quiet that precedes revolution. For striding through those gilded doors came Tyson, Duke of Rivershire, England's most coveted bachelor, and perhaps its most dangerous man. At 32, Tyson possesses the kind of masculine beauty that renders sensible women speechless and ambitious mothers positively predatory. His dark hair gleams like midnight under candlelight, his grey eyes hold secrets that could topple governments, and his bearing suggests a man who has never known defeat. More importantly, he commands a fortune that could purchase kingdoms and a bloodline that stretches back to the conquest. For 3 seasons, every unmarried lady in London has set her cap for the Duke of Rivershire. Melanie, the season's reigning diamond, with her porcelain complexion and calculated charm, has practically declared war on any woman who dares approach him. Xavier, a lord whose handsome face conceals a mind as sharp as any blade, has positioned himself as Tyson's closest confidant, though I suspect his motives are far from pure friendship. Yet on this night, as every eye tracked the Duke's progress through the crowd, as every eligible lady preened and positioned herself in his path, something unprecedented occurred. Tyson's gaze swept past Melanie's calculated curtsy, ignored Xavier's enthusiastic greeting, and landed, I swear upon my very quill, upon Delora in her shadowed corner. The look that passed between them lasted no more than a heartbeat, yet I felt the very foundations of London society tremble. Here was the forgotten daughter, the spinster sister, the woman who believed herself invisible, suddenly seen by the one man every woman in England desired to capture. What followed, defied every rule of propriety and precedent. While Melanie simmered with barely concealed fury and Xavier's smile turned razor-sharp, Tyson crossed that ballroom with purpose. Not to claim a dance with a celebrated beauty, not to acknowledge the fawning courtesies of ambitious parents, but to bow, deeply, respectfully, before a woman's society had written off as irrelevant. Miss Delora, his voice carried clearly enough for a dozen eavesdroppers to commit every syllable to memory. Might I have the honor of the next dance? The silence that followed could have shattered crystal. Delora, bless her practical heart, stared at him as though he had sprouted wings. Clarine and Shania, radiant in their matrimonial triumph, gaped like landed fish. And Melanie. Oh, Melanie's face cycled through expressions that would have been comical were they not so venomous. But it was Delora's response that shall echo through the corridors of Mayfair for years to come. With quiet dignity that put every practiced belle to shame, she curtsied and replied, "The honor would be mine, your grace." And so they danced. The Duke who could have any woman in England and the forgotten sister who never expected to dance at all. While I watched from my perch, cataloguing every whisper, every gasp, every calculating glance, one question burned through my mind like wildfire. Tell me, dear listener, what power could possibly compel England's most desired Duke to bow before the one woman society had deemed unworthy of notice? Allow me to illuminate the shadows where truth hides, dear listener. For the dance I witnessed was merely the overture to a symphony of secrets that would make even my experienced heart flutter with anticipation. Delora, sweet, steadfast Delora, carries burdens that would crush lesser souls. When their father died 3 years past, leaving behind debts that could have drowned them all, it was she who took the reins of a crumbling household. While Clarine practiced her watercolours and Shania perfected her French, Delora sold her mother's jewellery piece by piece, dismissed servants they could no longer afford, and somehow, through sheer force of will and careful penny-pinching, maintained the facade that the family's finances remained intact. I have watched her these past seasons. This remarkable woman who sacrificed her own prospects to secure her sister's futures. She accepted spinsterhood as the price of their success, believing herself too plain, too practical, too old to inspire the kind of devotion that had blessed Clarine and Shania. Yet as I observed her dancing in Tyson's arms, I saw what the blind fools of the ton had missed. Intelligence that sparkled brighter than diamonds, strength that put marble to shame, and a heart capable of love so deep it could drown continents. But it is Tyson who presents the more intriguing puzzle, dear listener. The Duke of Rivershire did not earn his reputation for coldness without cause. 3 years ago, his younger brother perished in what society whispered was a scandalous duel over a married woman. The truth, as I have painstakingly uncovered, proves far more devastating. The boy died saving tenants from brutal debt collectors, making him a hero rather than a scoundrel. Yet Tyson has allowed the false narrative to persist, wearing the stain upon his family's honor like armor against a world that would exploit any weakness. Since that tragedy, the Duke has perfected the art of emotional distance. He conducts business with ruthless efficiency, attends social functions with polite detachment, and has rebuffed every matrimonial advance with such consistent indifference that most have ceased trying. Only Xavier has managed to maintain what passes for friendship with him, though I suspect the Lord's motives extend far beyond companionship. Then there is Melanie, beautiful, ambitious Melanie, who has spent 2 seasons positioning herself as the inevitable future Duchess of Rivershire. Her every appearance is calculated, every word measured, every smile deployed like a weapon in her campaign to capture the most coveted prize in England. She has cultivated an image of perfection so complete that many consider their eventual union a foregone conclusion. Yet as I watched Tyson guide Delora through the intricate steps of the waltz, I observed something that sent shivers down my spine. For the first time in 3 years, the Duke's carefully maintained mask slipped. When Delora stumbled slightly, a natural consequence of rarely dancing, and he steadied her with gentle strength, the look that crossed his face was nothing short of revelation. Here was a man discovering he possessed a heart, and finding it irrevocably drawn to the most unexpected woman in London. "Forgive me," Delora murmured, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I am not accustomed to such occasions." "The fault is mine," Tyson replied, his voice unusually tender. "I should have warned you that this particular waltz demands more courage than grace." Oh, the delicious irony, dear listener. While every other woman in that ballroom possessed the technical skill to dance circles around poor Delora, not one could have inspired the Duke to such gentleness. In that moment of stumbled steps and steadying hands, I witnessed the birth of something infinitely more dangerous than attraction. I saw the first stirrings of genuine affection. But love, as I have learned through years of observation, rarely blooms without obstacles. As the dance concluded and Tyson escorted Delora back to her corner, I noted Xavier's calculating expression and Melanie's barely suppressed fury. Both had recognized the threat that sweet, unassuming Delora posed to their carefully laid plans. "Your Grace seemed quite taken with my sister," Clarine observed later, her tone carefully neutral as she approached Delora. "He was merely being kind," Delora replied, though her fingers unconsciously touched the place where his hand had rested at her waist. "Dukes are trained in courtesy from birth." If only she knew, dear listener, that courtesy had nothing to do with the way Tyson's eyes had softened when she smiled, or how his usual Arctic composure had melted beneath her gentle warmth. But perhaps it is better that she remains unaware, for what I observed next would test every assumption about love, loyalty, and the lengths to which desperate hearts will go to claim what they desire. As the evening wound toward its close, I positioned myself near the card room, where Xavier cornered Tyson with the kind of urgent whisper that sets my journalistic instincts ablaze. "You're playing a dangerous game," Xavier murmured, his handsome face twisted with concern that struck me as entirely manufactured. "Delora is not what she appears, my friend. There are debts, secrets that could destroy you both." The Duke's response chilled me to the bone. "Then perhaps it is time some secrets saw the light." "What secrets, dear listener? What debts? And why do I suspect that Xavier's warning contained more threat than friendship?" 3 days after that fateful dance, dear listener, London society received its first taste of the scandal that would consume us all. It began, as these things often do, with a simple morning call that erupted into chaos worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy. Tyson arrived at the modest townhouse where Delora and her sisters maintained their increasingly precarious respectability. I must confess, I positioned myself strategically in the park across the street, for my instinct screamed that this visit would yield revelations worth their weight in gold. How right I was. The Duke's presence alone caused sufficient stir. His magnificent carriage drew curious stares from every window. His livery prompted excited whispers from passers-by. But it was his request to speak privately with Delora that sent shockwaves through the household, and inevitably through the gossip networks that I have spent years cultivating. "Your Grace," Delora stammered as he was shown into the family's modest drawing room. "This is most unexpected," Miss Delora, Tyson replied, his formal tone belied by the warmth in his grey eyes. I come with a proposition that I hope will benefit us both. How little they knew that their conversation was being observed by far more than my carefully positioned self. Xavier, ever the opportunist, had followed his supposed friend and now lurked in the garden, straining to catch every word through the partially open window. And Melanie, clever, calculating Melanie, had arrived for what she claimed was a social call, though her timing struck me as suspiciously convenient. I require a wife, Tyson continued, his directness apparently shocking poor Delora into speechlessness. Not for love, you understand, but for protection. There are those who would use my unmarried state against me, who spread whispers designed to damage my family's reputation further. The irony was exquisite, dear listener. Here was England's most desired bachelor, admitting vulnerability to the one woman who had never dared dream of catching his attention. Yet I sensed undercurrents in his words, depths that even Delora could not fathom. I offer you security, Tyson pressed on, for yourself and your family. Your sister's positions would be unassailable as relations to the Duchess of Rivershire. And you would have the means to clear whatever debts currently plague your household. Delora's sharp intake of breath confirmed what I had long suspected. The family's financial situation was far more dire than they had allowed society to believe. But before she could respond, catastrophe struck from multiple directions. Melanie chose that moment to make her entrance, sweeping into the drawing room with the kind of calculated surprise that fooled no one with half a brain. Delora, darling, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Her gaze fixed immediately upon Tyson, and the smile that curved her lips contained enough venom to fell an elephant. Your Grace, how delightful to find you here. Though I confess myself puzzled by your choice of company. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a cannon blast. Delora's cheeks flamed crimson, but before she could respond, Xavier materialized in the doorway with news that would shatter whatever peace remained. Tyson, my dear fellow, he announced with false joviality. You'll never guess what I've just learned. It seems our dear Delora has been less than forthcoming about her family's circumstances. In his hand, he held papers that made Delora's face drain of all colour. Promissory notes, I realized with growing horror. Evidence of the debts she had hidden so carefully, the financial house of cards that kept her family from complete ruin. Debts totaling nearly £5,000, Xavier continued with obvious relish. Secured against the family home, due within the month. Rather desperate circumstances for a woman entertaining proposals from dukes, wouldn't you say? The silence that followed could have cracked stone. Tyson's expression hardened into the Arctic mask I had grown accustomed to seeing him wear. Melanie's triumphant smile suggested a cat who had just cornered a particularly plump mouse. And Delora, poor, brave Delora, looked as though the earth had opened beneath her feet. Is this true? Tyson asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Yes, Delora whispered, her dignity intact, even as her world crumbled. Every word. I had hoped. I had planned to tell you myself, but you thought to trap a duke with your desperation, Melanie finished sweetly. How terribly common of you. The words hit Delora like physical blows, but it was Tyson's reaction that truly devastated her. The warmth that had softened his features during their dance vanished completely, replaced by the cold calculation that had made him legend among London's ruthless elite. I see, he said simply, rising from his chair with Arctic formality. I believe I have heard enough. Your Grace, Delora began, but he was already moving toward the door. "Xavier," Tyson called without turning back. "I believe we have business to discuss." And with that, he was gone, leaving Delora alone with Melanie's victorious laughter and the crushing weight of exposed secrets. I watched from my hidden vantage point as the Duke's carriage rolled away, taking with it any hope Delora might have harbored for escape from her desperate circumstances. But I also noted something that the others had missed in their rush to witness humiliation: the envelope that had fallen from Xavier's pocket during his dramatic revelation. An envelope bearing a crest I recognized, though its significance would not become clear until much later. As evening shadows lengthened across London, I found myself pondering the day's revelations: Xavier's perfectly timed arrival, Melanie's convenient visit, the papers that exposed Delora's secrets with surgical precision. All of it struck me as rather too coincidental for comfort. Tell me, dear listener, in a game where hearts serve as currency and reputations as weapons, who truly holds the cards? The week following that devastating morning call proved that London society possesses an appetite for scandal that borders on the cannibalistic, dear listener. Yet as the whispers spread through drawing rooms and ballrooms like wildfire, I detected undercurrents that suggested this particular drama was far from concluded. Delora had vanished from public view entirely, which only fueled the gossip mills further. Some claimed she had fled London in shame. Others whispered that Tyson had pensioned her off to avoid further embarrassment. Only I knew the truth: that she remained in her family's modest townhouse, working frantically to salvage what remained of their finances, while her sisters fretted about the potential damage to their own newly elevated positions. "Delora, you must see reason," Clarine pleaded during one of my carefully orchestrated observations from the garden next door. Perhaps Lord Xavier meant kindly by exposing the truth before things went too far. "Lord Xavier," Delora replied with uncharacteristic bitterness, "has been remarkably helpful in destroying what little reputation I possessed." How perceptive of her, dear listener, for I had been conducting my own investigation into the mysterious timing of recent events, and what I discovered would make even my scandal-hardened heart race with anticipation. Meanwhile, Tyson had retreated into icy formality that made his previous coldness seem positively warm by comparison. He attended his usual social obligations with mechanical precision, danced when duty demanded, and responded to conversation with Arctic civility that discouraged all but the most persistent social climbers. Yet I observed him during these performances, dear listener, and what I saw told a different story entirely. When he thought himself unobserved, his gaze would grow distant and troubled. During one particularly tedious musical, I watched him absently turn a small object over and over in his fingers, a pressed flower that could only have come from Delora's modest garden. Melanie, naturally, had positioned herself as his constant companion, interpreting his withdrawal as grief over his narrow escape from an unsuitable alliance. "You were so wise to discover her deception before it was too late," she cooed during Lady Pemberton's soiree. "A duke must be constantly vigilant against fortune hunters." "Indeed," Tyson replied with such cutting precision that even Melanie's confidence wavered momentarily. "But it was Xavier who truly captured my attention during these tense days. The man who had supposedly saved his dear friend from an avaricious schemer seemed unusually invested in ensuring that Tyson and Delora remained permanently separated. He appeared wherever the Duke went, filling conversational silences with carefully crafted poison about Delora's mercenary nature and Melanie's sterling character. "Mark my words," Xavier declared one evening as they shared brandy at their club. "Women like Delora are dangerous precisely because they appear so harmless. She would have made your life miserable with her debts and her desperate family. What Xavier did not know, dear listener, was that I had cultivated sources even within the hallowed halls of White's. The waiter who served their brandy had been in my employ for years, and his memory for conversation rivaled my own. "You speak as though you know her well," Tyson observed, his tone carefully neutral. "I make it my business to know anyone who might threaten my friends," Xavier replied smoothly. Besides, her circumstances were hardly secret among those who cared to look. Lies upon lies, dear listener. For my investigation had revealed that Delora's debts were indeed substantial, but they were not the desperate scrambling of a fortune hunter. Every penny had been spent securing her sisters' futures, gowns for their debuts, household expenses that maintained the facade of respectability, even the modest dowries that had helped secure their brilliant marriages. The girl was not mercenary. She was sacrificial to a fault. More intriguingly, I had discovered the source of Xavier's remarkably detailed knowledge about the family's finances. The moneylender who held their notes was none other than his own uncle, a connection that Xavier had been careful not to mention during his dramatic revelation. But the most shocking discovery came when I traced the ownership of those very notes. Through a labyrinth of legal documents that would have challenged a trained barrister, I learned that the debts had recently been purchased by a third party, a party whose identity was hidden behind layers of legal obfuscation, but whose motives were becoming increasingly clear. Someone wanted Delora desperate enough to accept any offer of rescue, someone who profited from her family's ruin and her separation from Tyson. The pieces began forming a picture so devious that even I, hardened chronicler of society's machinations, felt a chill of apprehension. Yet before I could act upon my discoveries, fate intervened in the form of an unscheduled encounter that would change everything. It happened during one of London's infamous November fogs, the kind that reduces visibility to mere feet and transforms familiar streets into alien landscapes. Tyson, returning from yet another futile attempt to lose himself in business, found his carriage halted by an overturned cart blocking the narrow lane. As he stepped down to assess the situation, a cloaked figure emerged from the swirling mist. Delora, returning from a dawn visit to the employment agency where she had been seeking position as a governess to support her family. They stood frozen in the grey twilight, two souls who had been dancing around each other's hearts without either daring to acknowledge the melody. The fog muffled the sounds of London around them, creating an intimate bubble where truth might finally be spoken. "Miss Delora," Tyson said quietly, his formal address belied by the raw longing in his voice. "Your Grace," she replied, her dignity intact despite the worn edges of her cloak and the shadows beneath her eyes. Neither moved to leave, though propriety demanded immediate flight. Instead, they remained suspended in that misty moment, studying each other's faces as though memorizing details for an uncertain future. Subscribe now if you haven't, for you don't want to miss tales like this. The fog-shrouded encounter I witnessed proved to be the catalyst for revelations that would shake the very foundations of London society, dear listener. For in that suspended moment of recognition, desperate hearts finally found the courage to speak truths that had been festering in silence. "I owe you an explanation," Delora began, her voice barely audible above the muffled sounds of the city around them. "You owe me nothing," Tyson replied, though his eyes betrayed the hunger for answers that had been consuming him. "I have no right to judge your circumstances or your choices. But you must understand," she pressed on, stepping closer through the swirling mist. "I never intended deception. When you made your proposal, I meant to tell you everything. But Lord Xavier, the name fell from Tyson's lips like a stone into still water. What of Xavier? And so, there in that grey cocoon that hid them from the world's prying eyes, Delora revealed the truth that I had been painstakingly uncovering. How Xavier had approached her days before the ball, claiming concern for Tyson's reputation, and warning that any woman who encouraged the Duke's attention without full disclosure of her circumstances would be branded a fortune hunter. How he had convinced her that honesty would only hurt Tyson's standing in society. He seemed so concerned for your welfare, Delora whispered, tears threatening to spill. I believed I was protecting you by keeping silent. The transformation that overcame Tyson in that moment was terrible to behold, dear listener. The careful control he had maintained for years cracked like ice beneath spring sun, revealing depths of fury that made my very soul tremble. Not fury at Delora. Oh no, his rage was directed at a far more deserving target. That bastard, he growled, his ducal composure completely abandoned. That calculating, manipulative bastard. But there was more. So much more that neither of them yet understood. For as they stood in their circle of mist-wrapped intimacy, I was receiving intelligence from my network of sources that would complete the devastating picture of Xavier's machinations. The man who had positioned himself as Tyson's dearest friend had been orchestrating this entire catastrophe from the beginning. He had purchased Delora's family debts through intermediaries, then timed their exposure to maximum effect. He had coached Melanie in her pursuit of the Duke, promising her his influence in exchange for her cooperation. Most damning of all, he had been spreading carefully crafted rumors about Tyson's mental stability, suggesting that the Duke was growing increasingly erratic and unsuitable for his responsibilities. Xavier's ultimate goal became clear with sickening precision. He intended to marry Melanie, position her as Duchess of Rivershire, then gradually assume control of the vast Tyson estates through his unstable friend's increasing dependence upon his guidance. But even I, with all my years of observing society's darkest impulses, was unprepared for the final revelation that emerged from the fog that morning. "There is something else," Tyson said, his voice heavy with the weight of old pain. "Something about my brother's death that Xavier knows but has kept hidden." The story that unfolded made my blood run cold, dear listener. Tyson's brother had not died in a duel over a married woman, as society believed. He had died protecting their tenants from violent debt collectors who had been acting on behalf of Xavier's own business interests. The heroic Xavier had arrived too late to prevent the tragedy, then crafted the scandal story to protect his own reputation while simultaneously destroying the family he had helped to devastate. "He has held this knowledge over me for 3 years," Tyson admitted, his voice raw with anguish. "Threatening to reveal the truth about my brother's shameful death if I ever challenged his version of events." Delora's gasp of horror echoed my own emotions. To lose a beloved brother, then be forced to let society believe him a scoundrel, while the real villain played the role of grieving friend. It was a torture, worthy of the most creative demons. "But why tell me this now?" Delora asked, reaching out instinctively to touch his arm before propriety stopped her. Tyson's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Because I find I care more about your opinion than society's. Because these past days without you have shown me that a life lived in fear is no life at all. And because—" He paused, his grey eyes boring into hers with intensity that could have melted steel. "Because I love you, Delora. Desperately, completely, and damn the consequences." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Here, in the heart of London's worst fog in decades, two hearts finally acknowledged the truth that I had been watching bloom for weeks. But love, as I have learned through countless observations, faces its greatest trials not in its absence, but in its presence. For even as Delora's face transformed with wonder and desperate hope, the sound of approaching footsteps through the mist announced that their moment of privacy was ending. Xavier emerged from the grey like a devil materializing from smoke, his handsome face arranged in expressions of concern and surprise. "Tyson, thank heavens I found you. When your carriage driver said you had wandered off into this soup." His gaze fell upon Delora, and I watched calculation flicker behind his eyes. "Miss Delora, how unexpected to find you here." "Indeed." Melanie's voice drifted through the fog as she appeared at Xavier's side, perfectly coiffed despite the dampness. One might almost think this meeting was arranged. The trap was closing, dear listener. Two hearts that had finally found each other were about to be torn apart by the very demons who had kept them separated. And the most maddening part was that neither Tyson nor Delora yet understood the full scope of the game being played against them. As the fog began to lift, revealing the four figures standing in that narrow lane like players on a stage, I prepared myself for the devastation that was surely to come. For I knew Xavier well enough to recognize the gleam in his eyes, the look of a predator who had cornered his prey at last. What followed that fog-shrouded encounter was a masterpiece of destruction so perfectly orchestrated that I found myself reluctantly admiring Xavier's skill, even as I despised his cruelty. Within hours, all of London was buzzing with a scandal so deliciously sordid that it overshadowed even the season's most dramatic revelations. The story, as it spread through drawing rooms and men's clubs with the speed of wildfire, painted a picture of desperate deception and ducal folly. Delora, the narrative went, had deliberately positioned herself in Tyson's path during that fateful fog, hoping to entrap him in a compromising situation. When discovered by Xavier and Melanie, she was found weeping and clinging to the Duke's arm, clearly attempting to force a proposal through manufactured scandal. "I saw it with my own eyes," Melanie declared at Lady Hartwick's tea, her voice heavy with perfectly calculated sorrow. The poor dear was actually begging him to marry her, claiming he had compromised her reputation by their private meeting. It was heartbreaking to witness such desperation. Xavier, meanwhile, positioned himself as the devoted friend who had saved Tyson from a fortune hunter's trap. "She's not evil," he told his audience at White's with admirable false charity, "merely desperate. When one's family faces ruin, even the most virtuous woman might resort to unfortunate measures. The cruel genius of their strategy lay in its apparent kindness. Neither Xavier nor Melanie spoke harshly of Delora. Indeed, they defended her with such gentle pity that their words cut deeper than any direct attack. They painted her as a tragic figure, driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond her control, making her appear both pathetic and predatory. Tyson's reaction to these rumors proved equally devastating to Delora's hopes. Rather than defend her publicly, he withdrew into Arctic silence that seemed to confirm every whispered accusation. He attended no social functions, accepted no visitors, and when forced to appear in public, treated all attempts at conversation with icy courtesy that discouraged further inquiry. What society did not know, dear listener, was the private war being waged in the Duke's own drawing room. Xavier had wasted no time in pressing his advantage, arriving at Tyson's residence with documents that revealed the full scope of his leverage. "You understand now why I was forced to act," Xavier said, spreading papers across Tyson's desk with theatrical precision. If Delora had succeeded in trapping you into marriage, these debts would have become your responsibility. £5,000 is merely the beginning. Her family's obligations stretch far deeper than even she realizes. The documents painted a picture of financial ruin so complete that it would have bankrupted even a duke's resources. Mortgages, loans, outstanding bills to dressmakers and jewelers. A mountain of debt that had been carefully hidden from society's view. She played you masterfully, Xavier continued, his voice heavy with false sympathy. Using her sister's marriages to gain credibility, positioning herself as the virtuous spinster, while plotting to ensnare the greatest prize in England. You must see that her very desperation makes her dangerous. But it was Xavier's final weapon that struck the killing blow. From his pocket, he produced a letter written in Delora's own hand. A letter addressed to a supposed moneylender, offering to secure her family's debts through advantageous marriage to a gentleman of substantial fortune. The letter was, of course, a forgery so skillful that even I might have been deceived. But Tyson, already reeling from the weight of evidence against the woman he loved, accepted it as confirmation of his worst fears. "She never loved me," he said quietly, the words falling like stones into a bottomless well. "It was always about the money." Xavier's expression of regret was worthy of the finest actor on Drury Lane's stage. "I'm sorry, my friend, truly sorry. But better you learn this now than after she had succeeded in her scheme." Meanwhile, Delora faced her own version of hell in the modest townhouse that had once sheltered her family's fading gentility. Clarine and Shania, horrified by the scandal threatening their own newly elevated positions, subjected their sister to interrogations that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. "How could you be so foolish?" Clarine demanded, her golden beauty marred by anxiety. "Meeting him alone in the fog like some common trollop. Do you have any idea what this has done to our reputations?" "Perhaps it would be best," Shania added with the casual cruelty of youth, "if you removed yourself from London entirely, at least until the gossip dies down." The suggestion hit Delora like a physical blow, to be exiled by her own sisters, the very women whose happiness she had purchased with her own sacrifice, was a betrayal so profound that even I felt my cynical heart crack with sympathy. But the final blow came in the form of a letter delivered by Tyson's own footman, a letter that contained neither explanation nor comfort, but simply the cold, formal notice that all communication between them must cease for the sake of both their reputations. As I watched Delora read those devastating lines through my carefully positioned spyglass, I witnessed the exact moment when hope died in her eyes. The woman who had endured poverty, sacrifice, and social humiliation with quiet dignity finally crumbled beneath the weight of a broken heart. The fog that had brought them together had become the mist that tore them apart, and London's cruelest season had claimed another victim. Rain began to fall as I penned these observations, dear listener, drumming against my window like tears shed by heaven itself. For how does one survive when love becomes the very weapon used to destroy us? When the man who claimed to cherish you allows the world to believe you a scheming fortune hunter? When your own family casts you aside to protect their newfound status? The ton adores tragedy, so long as it is not their own. Yet as I watched love die in that narrow street where it had been born, I found myself wondering if some wounds cut too deep for even redemption to heal. Sometimes, dear listener, salvation arrives wearing the most unlikely disguise. In this case, it appeared in the form of a crumpled letter discovered by pure accident in the lending library where Delora had sought refuge from her own home. She had been hiding among the poetry stacks, finding solace in verses that spoke of love and loss with the kind of honesty that society refused to allow. It was there, retrieving a fallen volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, that her fingers brushed against a piece of paper that had been carelessly discarded behind the shelves. The letter, written in Xavier's distinctive hand, was addressed to a Mr. Cornelius Fletcher, a name that meant nothing to Delora, but everything to me. For Fletcher was one of London's most notorious forgers, a man whose skill with pen and paper had ruined more reputations than plague had claimed lives. "The Delora matter proceeds excellently," the letter read. "The forged correspondence has been delivered and accepted without question. Tyson grows more dependent upon my counsel daily, and Melanie plays her part to perfection. Within the month, I expect to have secured both the marriage contract and his signature on the estate management documents that will give me effective control of his holdings." Delora's hands trembled as she read, understanding flooding through her like winter sunlight after months of darkness. Every cruel whisper, every perfectly timed revelation, every seemingly coincidental encounter, all of it had been orchestrated by the man Tyson trusted most. But knowledge without power to act upon it is merely torture refined, and Delora faced the impossible task of convincing a man who believed her a scheming fortune hunter that his dearest friend was the true villain of this piece. It was then that fate intervened in the form of an unexpected ally. Clarine appeared at the library entrance, her usual composure shattered by guilt and growing suspicion about recent events. "Delora," she whispered urgently, glancing around to ensure they were not observed. "I must speak with you. Something is not right about Lord Xavier's story." The sisters found a secluded corner where Clarine revealed her own discoveries. During a dinner party the previous evening, she had overheard Xavier speaking with Melanie about the final phase of their plan and ensuring Tyson remained isolated until the wedding could take place. "At first I thought they merely referred to preventing any reconciliation between you," Clarine admitted, shame colouring her cheeks. "But then Melanie said something about managing his estates once they were wed. And Xavier laughed about the benefits of an unstable husband." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Xavier intended not merely to marry his conspirator to Tyson, but to have the Duke declared mentally unfit, seizing control of one of England's greatest fortunes, while the true owner lived as a prisoner in his own home. "We must warn him," Delora said, though her heart broke at the thought of seeing the man who had cast her aside so completely. "He will not receive you," Clarine replied gently. "But perhaps there is another way." Meanwhile, dear listener, Tyson was experiencing his own moment of devastating clarity. The breaking point came during what Xavier had arranged as a private dinner to celebrate the Duke's escape from an unsuitable entanglement. As wine flowed and Xavier's tongue loosened, the mask of friendship began to slip. "You know," Xavier mused, swirling brandy in his glass, "Melanie will make you an excellent duchess. Beautiful, accomplished, and most importantly, properly grateful for her elevation. Unlike some women who mistake a duke's kindness for weakness." "Meaning?" Tyson's voice carried a warning that Xavier, emboldened by drink, chose to ignore. "Oh, you know the type. Poor relations who fancy themselves entitled to more than their station allows. Delora was perfect, really. Just desperate enough to be useful, just plain enough to seem harmless. If you hadn't discovered her scheme when you did—" The words trailed off as Xavier realized he had said too much, but the damage was done. For the first time in years, Tyson saw his supposed friend clearly, saw the calculation behind the concern, the greed beneath the guidance. "Get out," Tyson said quietly. "I beg your pardon?" "Get out of my house before I do something we'll both regret." Xavier's face cycled through confusion, indignation, and finally cold fury. "You're making a mistake, Tyson. Without my help, you'll be at the mercy of every fortune hunter in London. You need me." "What I need," Tyson replied, his voice carrying the authority of generations of noble breeding, "is never to see your face again." As Xavier stormed out, slamming doors with the petulance of a thwarted child, Tyson sank into his chair and allowed the full weight of his mistakes to crush down upon him. He had thrown away the love of the most genuine woman he had ever known, based on the lies of a man whose friendship had been mere calculation. But even as shame and regret consumed him, a spark of his old determination began to flicker. He had lost Delora through his own blind trust and cowardice. But perhaps, just perhaps, love deserved a second chance. The battle for redemption was about to begin, dear listener, and even power must bow to love when pride is finally spent. At the most unlikely of venues, Lady Pemberton's charity auction, an event so tediously virtuous that attendance was considered both social duty and penance. Yet it was here that truth and deception would clash in a battle worthy of the ancient epics. Tyson arrived with grim determination, knowing that both Xavier and Melanie would be present, confident in their approaching victory. What they did not expect was to find Delora seated quietly in the back row, flanked by both her sisters in a show of family solidarity that had taken considerable courage to arrange. The first shock came when Clarine publicly cut Xavier dead, turning away from his greeting with such pointed disdain that the assembled company gasped in collective recognition of a social execution. The second occurred when Shania, sweet young Shania, who had never been known to speak above a whisper, rose during the auction to make an announcement that silenced even the most persistent chatterboxes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she declared, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned assembly, "I believe we have all been deceived by a master of manipulation, and it is time the truth was known." What followed was a revelation so perfectly orchestrated that I suspect the sisters had been taking lessons from me in the art of public destruction. Clarine produced the letter Delora had discovered, reading Xavier's own words aloud to an audience that hung on every syllable. Shania revealed the conversations she had overheard, painting a picture of conspiracy that made even the most charitable listeners recoil in horror. But it was Delora herself who delivered the killing blow, rising with quiet dignity that put every practiced society belle to shame. "I stand before you not to defend my reputation," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "but to warn you all about a man who would destroy lives for profit, who would betray friendship for gain, and who has proven that evil can wear the mask of respectability." Xavier's face had progressed through several shades of rage during these revelations, but it was Melanie who finally cracked under pressure. Perhaps it was the weight of so many accusatory stares, or perhaps simple fear of being dragged down with her co-conspirator, but she suddenly stood and pointed a trembling finger at Xavier. "It was all his idea!" she shrieked, her careful composure completely shattered. "He promised me the Duke would be declared unfit, that I would control everything. I never wanted to hurt anyone." The confession that spilled forth painted a picture of such calculated cruelty that even I, seasoned observer of society's darkest impulses, felt my blood run cold. Xavier had indeed orchestrated every detail. The forged letter, the perfectly timed revelations, even the careful cultivation of Tyson's isolation and dependence. But it was his final scheme that proved most shocking. Documents hidden in his coat revealed plans to have Tyson committed to an asylum after the wedding, using testimony from carefully bribed physicians who would declare the Duke mentally unstable due to his erratic behavior following his brother's death. The room erupted in chaos as the full scope of Xavier's treachery became clear. Gentlemen who had considered him a friend recoiled in disgust. Ladies who had trusted his counsel drew back as though he carried plague. Society's judgment, once aroused, can be more devastating than any legal proceeding. Through it all, Tyson stood frozen in the center of the storm, his eyes locked on Delora's face. Here was the woman he had wronged so terribly, the heart he had broken with his blind stupidity, standing before London's elite to defend not herself, but him. As the crowd's attention focused on Xavier's desperate attempts at denial and Melanie's continued hysteria, Tyson moved through the chaos like a man in a dream. Step by step, he approached the woman who had become both his salvation and his judgment. "Delora," he said, his voice barely audible above the tumult around them. She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw not the anger he deserved, but a sadness so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. "I know," she said simply. "I know you believed their lies. I know you thought the worst of me, but I also know why." Before he could respond, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You have been surrounded by deception for so long that truth became impossible to recognize. But you learned, Tyson. You chose to see clearly, and that is what matters." The forgiveness in her voice, the understanding in her touch, proved more devastating than any reproach could have been. Here, in the midst of society's greatest scandal in decades, Tyson finally understood what love truly meant. Not the desperate clinging of possession, but the gentle strength of acceptance. "Marry me," he said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly through the room despite the continuing chaos. "Not because of duty or desperation or scandal, but because I love you more than life itself." The entire assembly fell silent, 200 pairs of eyes focused on the Duke and the woman he had wronged so publicly. Delora studied his face for a long moment, searching for something only she could identify. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder for all to hear. "Yes, I will marry you." The cheers that erupted could have been heard in Parliament itself, dear listener. London society, having witnessed the greatest romantic drama of their generation, celebrated with the enthusiasm usually reserved for military victories. And thus, dear listener, London gained not a reformed duke, but a redeemed one. 6 months later, dear listener, I find myself seated in the gardens of Rivershire House, watching the most extraordinary transformation that even my experienced eyes have ever witnessed. The modest morning ceremony had blossomed into an afternoon celebration that would be remembered as the wedding of the decade. Not for its grandeur, though that was considerable, but for the genuine joy that radiated from every corner of the estate. Delora, now the Duchess of Rivershire, moved through her guests with a grace that put every artificial society belle to shame. Gone was the self-effacing spinster who had hidden in shadowed corners. In her place stood a woman who had discovered her own worth through the crucible of scandal, and emerged refined rather than broken. Tyson never strayed more than arm's length from his bride's side, and the transformation in him proved equally remarkable. The Arctic reserve that had characterized his demeanor for years had melted away, replaced by warmth that made him appear younger, more approachable, utterly human. When he looked at his Duchess, and he looked at her constantly, his face held the wonder of a man who had discovered treasure in his own backyard. "They seem happy," Clarine observed, joining me beneath the ancient oak where I had positioned myself for optimal observation. Her own guilt over her initial treatment of Delora had transformed into fierce protectiveness that would have impressed a mother bear. "Indeed they do," I replied, watching as Tyson leaned down to whisper something that made Delora laugh with abandoned delight. True happiness always recognizes itself. Shania approached with her husband in tow, her young face glowing with satisfaction at her role in the dramatic revelation that had saved her sister. "Do you think they'll be all right, after everything that happened?" I considered the question while observing the couple in question. Tyson was helping Delora navigate the garden steps with tender care, his hand steady at her elbow. His attention completely focused on her comfort rather than the dozens of guests who sought his notice. When she stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, his arms came around her immediately, and the look that passed between them contained enough heat to melt glaciers. "My dear child," I replied with complete certainty, "they will be more than all right. They will be legendary." The fate of Xavier provided its own satisfying conclusion to our tale. Exposed as a fraud and fortune hunter of the worst sort, he had fled London within days of the charity auction debacle. Rumours placed him in America, attempting to rebuild his reputation among colonials who had not yet learned of his disgrace. Melanie, somewhat more fortunate due to her youth and tearful confessions, had retired to her family's country estate, where she was reportedly learning the virtues of quiet obscurity. But it was the smaller details that truly warmed my chronicler's heart, dear listener. Delora's family debts had been cleared within a week of the engagement announcement, not through Tyson's ducal largesse, but through his methodical investigation that revealed how Xavier had artificially inflated and manipulated every figure. The actual obligations, while substantial, proved manageable once freed from deliberate deception. More touchingly, Tyson had commissioned a memorial for his brother in the village, where the young man had died protecting tenants. The truth of that tragic day now stood carved in marble for all to see, transforming shame into honor and lies into legacy. As afternoon melted into evening and the last guests departed, I prepared to take my own leave. But a gentle touch on my arm stopped my retreat, and I turned to find Delora herself approaching with the kind of knowing smile that suggested my careful anonymity might not be as complete as I believed. "Thank you," she said simply, pressing a small sealed note into my hands, "for watching over us all when we were too blind to see clearly ourselves." Before I could respond with suitable denials of any special knowledge, she had glided away to rejoin her husband, who was waiting with patient devotion and eyes that followed her every movement. The note, when I opened it later in the privacy of my own chambers, contained just a few words. "Some guardian angels write with quills rather than harps. With eternal gratitude, D." How she had identified me remains a mystery that I shall carry to my grave, dear listener. Perhaps love, once perfected, grants its own form of supernatural sight. As I pen these final observations, rain patters gently against my windows. Not the harsh downpour of sorrow, but the soft shower that nourishes new growth. Somewhere across London, the Duke and Duchess of Rivershire are beginning their life together in a house finally filled with laughter rather than secrets. Their love story stands as proof that even the most wounded hearts can heal when touched by genuine affection, that truth will eventually triumph over the most elaborate deception, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. Indeed, even the coldest heart may bloom again beneath the scandalous sun of love. Do you believe redemption rewrites every sin of pride, dear listener? I have witnessed its power firsthand, and I can tell you that love, true love, possesses an alchemy that transforms base metal into gold, scandal into legend, and broken souls into something beautifully whole. Whisper your thoughts to the wind and stay tuned for my next revelation. For in London, there is always another romance waiting to unfold, another scandal brewing in the shadows, and another heart preparing to surrender to love's sweet tyranny. Until then, I remain your devoted chronicler of passion's follies and love's ultimate triumphs. Lady Whistledown. If love's triumph moved your heart, subscribe, like and share for more scandalous tales.